What if one of the most powerful fortunes of the Whitney dynasty had a missing heir whose name was carefully erased, line by line, until history itself agreed to forget she ever existed? Tonight, we step into that silence. The story of Amalia Whitney does not begin with a ball or a wedding announcement in the society pages. It begins in the dust of an archive, in a locked drawer inside a Gilded Age mansion, where the air still smells faintly of coal smoke, old leather, and dried ink. Picture the late 1890s, Fifth Avenue carriages rattling past facades of carved limestone, clubs and parlors glowing with gaslight. And inside the Whitney household, a network of ledgers, private bankers, and family attorneys quietly shaping who would be allowed to belong to the dynasty and who would be quietly written out. Among the neat columns of numbers and the ornate crests on letterhead, there are gaps. A line where an account should exist but does not, an erased initial, a banking transfer that shifts overnight from one Whitney to an unnamed beneficiary, then vanishes. A faint imprint appears on an older draft of a will. Amalia H. Whitney, scratched through so violently the paper nearly tears. Officially, no scandal was ever recorded. The newspapers of the time celebrated the family's philanthropy, their new wings in museums and hospitals, their presence at charity balls. But behind those glowing headlines, house staff whispered about a daughter whose name stopped being spoken, a young woman whose future had once been secured by a trust fund that, according to the final version of the documents, never existed at all. Testimonies that mentioned her were corrected. Correspondence that referred to her share of the estate was burned in the grate, and attorneys who asked too many questions suddenly shifted firms or left New York altogether. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion, where the real scandal is not a crime of passion, but a deliberate act of erasure? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or forgotten heir, share it below, because this channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase. So subscribe before you lose sight of it. And leave a like so this investigation reaches more eyes than the Whitney lawyers ever intended. We will follow the trail of letters burned just before probate, of suspicious transfers to European accounts, of internal decisions taken in wood-paneled studies where only family and their most trusted advisors were allowed to sit. Somewhere between the drafts of Henry Whitney's wills, the private notes of his bankers, and the fragments left in minor court filings, the outline of Amalia's stolen inheritance begins to reappear. And if a name could be removed from the record so completely, we have to ask, what was so dangerous about this woman and about what she was promised that an entire family chose to bury her in paper instead of stone? This is where the unknown case of Amalia Whitney begins, at the moment when the ink that erased her finally starts to fade. By the time you step back from the dust and look at the broader picture, the story of Amalia Whitney is no longer just a crossed-out line in a ledger, but a missing piece inside an empire built on steel, railroads, and leverage. The Whitney name traveled farther than any family carriage, stamped on freight contracts, steel beams, and discreet envelopes sent to Washington and Albany. In the last decades of the 19th century, while the robber barons of the Gilded Age carved up rail lines and fixed prices in quiet hotel suites, Henry Whitney was one of the men who knew exactly how much a mile of track, a ton of steel, or a delayed shipment could cost his rivals. His mansions were only the visible tip of the fortune. The real power lived in bond certificates, long-term leases, and private agreements, the kind of Golden Age secrets that rarely left the family desk. Somewhere inside that machinery, Amalia's inheritance once had a defined place, written into early drafts as if her future were as solid as the rail lines crossing the continent. In one set of records, you still see it, a trust created in her name when she was a child, fed quietly by dividends from a smaller rail company the Whitneys controlled through intermediaries. The handwriting is careful, almost affectionate, her name spelled out in full. In a later version, the same trust exists, the income unchanged, but the beneficiary has a different designation. A cousin with stronger marital alliances, a nephew whose father had proved more useful when a regulation needed to be softened. The ink is the same, The date barely altered, and yet the shift is enormous. You can almost feel the pause in the penstroke where Amalia once began, replaced by a more strategic choice. No one needed to say that some heirs were more useful than others. In that world, usefulness was measured in connections, marriages, and silence, not in fairness. Follow the money a little further, and the pattern becomes familiar to anyone who has studied these dark legacy stories. A side account vanishes from one bank in New York and reappears in a discreet institution in London, then in Paris, then comes back under a different Whitney relative's name just before a major merger is announced. Minutes from board meetings, preserved in a private archive, record adjustments to family interests, but never specify who lost what. The Whitneys were not the only ones who played like this. Hidden heirs and erased records were almost a quiet tradition in these circles. What makes Amalia's case different is how completely her part of the inheritance was redistributed, as if someone had decided not only that she should receive nothing, but that the trace of what she was promised should itself become invisible. Inside the mansions that Beyond the Golden Halls loves to revisit, the high ceilings, the forbidden rooms at the end of shadowed corridors, the portrait galleries where some faces seem to watch you back. The social logic behind these decisions comes into focus. A daughter who did not marry the right man, who refused a match proposed at the right club, or who expressed opinions in the wrong drawing room, could find her name quietly drifting to the margins of the estate plan. The same attorneys who protected fortunes from taxes could also restructure them so completely that, on paper, she had never been meant to receive anything at all. Servants became silent witnesses to hushed arguments behind closed doors, to letters that arrived one morning and disappeared that same night into the fire. Seen from a distance of more than a century, it is tempting to ask whether any of this truly mattered, one erased name among many in a class obsessed with preserving itself. But when you trace each transfer, each altered record, each correction, you begin to feel how deliberate the exclusion was. Amalia's inheritance did not simply evaporate, it was absorbed, redirected, weaponized to strengthen other branches of the dynasty. Properties that once formed part of her expected dowry ended up backing a brother's investment or securing a marriage alliance that tied the Whitneys to another railway clan. In that sense, her absence funded the continued rise of the very world that pushed her to the edges. And here is where the story turns back to you for a moment. Looking at these Golden Age secrets, at this methodical removal of a woman from her own history, you have to wonder, if you had discovered these papers in a forgotten box, would you speak, or would you stay silent and slide them back where you found them, letting the dark legacy remain intact? It is the kind of question the families of the Gilded Age quietly asked themselves every time a maid saw too much. A junior lawyer noticed an inconsistency, or a distant cousin compared two versions of the same will and realized they did not match. As more fragments of the Whitney archive come to light, drafts, marginal notes, a ledger where a line of income suddenly changes designation. The mystery around Amalia deepens rather than resolves. The logic of inheritance and succession in that era was both precise and elastic. Precise when it came to protecting the fortune, elastic whenever human lives and expectations stood in the way. Beneath the marble staircases and etched glass doors of those mansions, the real architecture was made of decisions no one outside the family was supposed to see. The methods used to control access to archives, to keep certain files in private collections and off the shelves of public institutions, to ensure that certain names never appeared in published genealogies, all point to a carefully managed erasure. In one of the last documents linked to this case, an internal memorandum from a family attorney, there is a reference to closing the matter permanently, written shortly after Henry Whitney's death. No details, no names, just a note that a particular portfolio had been successfully consolidated under other heirs. Attached to that memo, folded and almost forgotten, is a smaller sheet, a rough diagram of rooms on an upper floor of a Whitney residence, with one doorway sketched in pencil and then rubbed out until the paper thins. Next to that faint erased door, a single word survives, barely visible under the lamplight. Amalia. The rest of the page is empty, as if the silence that followed had learned how to write itself. If the erased doorway on that folded floor plan once led anywhere, it likely opened into the kind of room where the fate of a daughter could be decided with a single nod from the head of the family. In the Gilded Age, a woman like Amalia Whitney did not simply fall in love. She was presented, evaluated, and positioned like an asset in a complex portfolio of alliances. The Whitney mansion hosted the usual rituals: winter balls, carefully curated dinners, charity events where the guest lists read like a directory of railroad and steel dynasties. And somewhere in those glittering evenings, the outline of Amalia's future was drawn. Her dance partners were not random. They were sons of bankers, lawyers tied to the railroads, heirs to coal and shipping fortunes. Yet the man who eventually appears beside her name in the few surviving personal notes is conspicuously wrong for the script her family had spent years preparing. The surviving fragments, an entry in a church register, a private letter preserved by accident in another family's archive, a clipped society notice folded into an envelope, agree on a few details. He was not poor exactly, but he came from a line of merchants and immigrant capital, a Catholic family whose money was new, whose manners were tolerated but never truly welcomed in the drawing rooms of old New York. In an era when marriages were quiet transactions between Protestant dynasties, this match landed somewhere between miscalculation and defiance. The language used in the internal notes is revealing in its coldness. One attorney's margin comment refers to the engagement as inadvisable. A cousin writes that Amalia had allowed her sympathies to outweigh her obligations. A memorandum drafted for Henry Whitney's eyes only describes the union as socially compromising, a phrase that says everything without naming a single emotion. The ceremony itself barely registers in the society pages, where other Whitney weddings earned full columns, descriptions of lace, flowers, the guest list. This one is a short paragraph wedged between a milliner's advertisement and a notice about a new rail spur. At first glance, it reads like any other small announcement. Look closer, and you notice what is missing. No mention of prominent guests, no listing of the families present, no reference to the grandeur of the reception. It is as if the marriage took place in a quieter, dimmer corner of the city, away from the chandeliers and orchestrated applause that usually accompanied such unions. In one private letter, a distant aunt describes arriving at the church and realizing that the Whitney pews were half empty. The words she chooses are careful. We felt obliged to attend. But the empty spaces between the sentences are louder than anything she writes. Within the Whitney house, the change in atmosphere around Amalia was not announced, but it was enacted in small, precise gestures. Servants, those silent witnesses of Golden Age secrets, later told of how her monogrammed linens were moved from the family linen press to a less prominent cupboard, how her portrait was temporarily taken down from the main staircase under the pretext of being reframed and never returned. Seating plans for dinners, preserved by chance in an old stationery box, show her name drifting from the center of the table toward the margins, then vanishing altogether. When she visited, if she visited, her place was no longer guaranteed. In the language of the era, no one said she was punished for marrying the wrong man. Instead, the family narrative shifted with a practiced elegance. Her exclusion from certain events was presented as a matter of delicate circumstances, her absence from formal photographs as an issue of health or travel. Inside the legal sphere, however, the language grew more blunt. Drafts of estate documents began to refer to qualified issue and approved lines, terms that could be stretched just enough to exclude a daughter whose marriage complicated the family's public image. In that legalistic code, you can see the price of protecting a legacy. It is always paid in someone else's life. What makes this part of the story feel particularly Gilded Age is how seamlessly the machinery of reputation management slid into place around her. The same men who arranged railway mergers also knew how to manipulate the press so that a marriage like Amalia's never became a full-blown scandal, only a quiet embarrassment. Friendly editors were reminded of the Whitney advertising budget, certain reporters were invited to more interesting stories. A photograph taken on the steps of a Whitney residence shows the family arrayed in perfect order, with one narrow gap where another person could have stood. To most readers of the time, it was just a portrait. To anyone who knew, it was a picture of absence. Decades later, in public archives, the record of her marriage is thin enough to pass unnoticed. A lone entry in a marriage register, a name in a city directory, a stray mention in a shipping manifest that places her traveling under her married name rather than Whitney. The official Whitney genealogies, commissioned and printed on fine paper for private circulation, list Henry's children with decorative flourishes around the names that continued the dynasty. Amalia's name appears once in an early draft, in a faded pencil notation, later overwritten in ink. In the final, printed version, she is gone, as if she had never walked through the forbidden rooms of those mansions, never looked out over the avenue from behind lace curtains, never signed her name beside a man the family had not chosen. From a distance, it might seem that the story ends there, a hidden heir quietly disinherited because of a socially inadequate marriage, a dark legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among the younger cousins. But the documents we have been following suggest something more deliberate. The timing of her removal from the inheritance discussions coincides not only with her marriage, but with a series of financial maneuvers that benefited specific relatives whose own alliances were more valuable to the Whitney empire. Her personal choice, or what appeared as a choice, became the pretext. The real motive may lie in the narrowing corridor of who was allowed to hold power within the family structure. That is the weight of the secrets we are moving through now. A life rearranged so that the official story could remain spotless, while the human cost was sealed inside rooms whose doors no longer appear on the plans. The files that might have defended her, the private letters, the early drafts of wills, the candid notes of family friends, were the easiest to destroy. Fire leaves no appeals. Ink that once defended her claims could be turned into erased records with a few passes of a pen, and the witnesses who might have spoken on her behalf, the maid who carried messages, the junior clerk who copied the first version of the trust, lived and died without anyone ever asking their side. In the end, what we are left with is not a confession, but a handful of contradictions. A later Whitney memoir insists that all Henry's children were properly provided for, yet the surviving banking ledgers show income streams redirected away from Amalia's branch. A charitable donation made in her married name appears once in a newspaper column, hinting at a woman who remained active, generous, refusing to vanish on command. That single notice stands like an object out of place on a perfectly arranged mantelpiece, contradicting the official narrative that she had faded into irrelevance. And somewhere, in a private collection not yet catalogued, there is said to be a wedding portrait commissioned in the early years of her marriage. Amalia in pale silk, the man at her side looking both proud and slightly out of step with the world she came from. The version that occasionally surfaces in family lore shows only her, a composition so carefully cropped that the viewer cannot see whose hand once rested on her arm. Look closely at the margin and you can still make out the faint outline of another shoulder, another presence, painted over in the same warm tones as the background. It is a picture that has learned how to lie politely. The canvas hangs, the surface calm, and yet in the blurred edge where his face used to be, the silence feels almost louder than the portrait itself, as if the real reason for her erasure were still standing there, just beyond what anyone is allowed to see. Long before anyone spoke openly about erased records or a dark legacy, the story of Amalia Whitney had already been reduced to what no longer existed. You can trace the outline of that absence not just in what survives, but in the quiet, disciplined work of destruction that took place behind the carved doors and velvet curtains of the Whitney world. In the Gilded Age, fortunes were not only built in boardrooms and on railroad tracks, they were protected in back rooms where paper met fire. Families like the Whitneys understood that a single sheet of paper, a draft of a will, a letter written in anger, a memorandum that named the wrong person as an heir, could be more dangerous than any whispered rumor. The habit of cleaning the files began, as far as we can tell, in a room most visitors never saw. In the basement of one of the Whitney residences, past the servant corridors and the laundry, there was a narrow office with a window at ground level. From the street, you would have noticed only a rectangle of glass near the sidewalk, a faint glow at odd hours. Inside, clerks copied letters, balanced ledgers, and prepared the papers that floated up the grand staircase to be signed in better light. It was in that room, according to a report left by an aging employee decades later, that the first deliberate removal of Amalia's name took place. He describes a junior partner from the family's law firm arriving late one evening with a leather portfolio, placing it on the table with a care that felt almost reverent, and saying, "These will not exist by morning." In that short, carefully written statement, found many years later in a box of unsorted material donated to an archive, the former clerk does not indulge in emotion. He notes details instead: the way the lawyer's gloves remained on as he unfolded the documents, the faint scent of cigar smoke that clung to the pages, the way the gaslight flickered when the furnace door opened. Among the papers were what he calls the older arrangements, versions of agreements and drafts in which Amalia's share of the Whitney inheritance was still intact. Certain figures had been circled in pencil, initials underlined. The clerk remembers being told to retain the structure but eliminate the reference, instructions that would have sounded technical to anyone else. To him, standing between the furnace and the desk, it was clear enough. The family had decided which version of their history should survive. This kind of encobrimento was not unique to the Whitneys. It was part of a wider pattern among the elite. Wealthy Americans of that period were becoming more conscious of their public image, commissioning private genealogies, carefully curated biographies, even early forms of public relations to present their narratives as clean, inevitable ascents. Behind those polished surfaces, there were regular bonfires of inconvenient truth. Law firms maintained sanitized files for potential scrutiny and deep files for internal use, until a scandal threatened, at which point the deep files quietly stopped existing. When a hidden heir like Amalia complicated the logic of herança et succession, the solution was not a public confrontation. It was the controlled disappearance of paper. You see this in how the trail breaks. In one archive, there is a reference to Whitney Estate File A17, suppressed by instruction, March 1902. No contents, no explanation. The notation appears in a register maintained by a city clerk, not by the family themselves, which makes it harder to erase. A few pages later, another line: replacement documents received, April 1902. The replacement file survives. It shows a lineage with no mention of an inconvenient daughter, no trust in her name, no contested promises. The erased file is a ghost, acknowledged only in that thin, impatient stroke of the pen, suppressed. The report of the former employee, written decades after he left Whitney's service, fills in some of the gaps. He recalls more than one night when trunks of paper arrived from the family law offices, brought down the servants' stairs instead of through the front door. The instructions were always the same: separate what was needed for the official record, consign the rest to the furnace. He describes the rustle of thick paper, the weight of sealed envelopes that would never be opened by anyone again, the way certain documents were held back for just a moment, read one last time under the yellow light, and then dropped into the fire. In one of those envelopes, he insists, there was a letter in a woman's hand, addressed to my father Henry, folded around what felt like a sheaf of formal pages, likely the original terms of Amalia's inheritance. He remembers a ring pressed into the sealing wax, a crest he had seen etched into the mansion's windows. He remembers the way the wax cracked when the envelope was opened, and how the lawyer's jaw tightened before he tossed both letter and contents into the flames. The fear driving this process was not abstract. Newspapers of the era loved nothing more than a Golden Age scandal, especially if it involved hidden heirs and secret fortunes. Editors knew that their readers, looking up at the facades of the great houses, wanted to imagine what might be happening in the forbidden rooms, beyond those windows. For a family like the Whitneys, the risk was not only financial, it was reputational. A contested will could bring years of litigation, public testimony, depositions from servants and clerks who had been silent witnesses for too long. Letters that were never meant for daylight could be read aloud in court, each sentence eroding the carefully constructed image of unity and benevolence. So the records were not simply disposed of. They were dismantled with strategy. Copies, kept in bank vaults, quietly disappeared during routine reorganizations. Memoranda mentioning Amalia by name were trimmed, literally cut with scissors, leaving only the parts that referred to more acceptable heirs. In a few surviving letter books, you can see the scars of this surgery, pages where long passages have been excised, leaving gaps like missing teeth, references to enclosed schedules that no longer accompany the correspondence. Public-facing documents were recopied in neat, consistent ink, the handwriting of a clerk who had never met the people whose lives were being rearranged on the page. All of this might have remained invisible if not for one last layer of record-keeping that the family could not fully control: the habits of institutions. Libraries and public offices had their own logic, their own duty to preserve. A city archive, for example, might retain the index card for a file even if the contents went missing, a small, unintentional act of resistance. Decades later, researchers opening drawers of faded cards find phrases that contradict the official story. A note about Whitney, H, disputed bequest re, daughter A, stands alone, the corresponding folder empty. The card is a witness that cannot be cross-examined, a reminder that something once existed where there is now nothing. That is the weight of this particular secret. You are not only looking at what was done to Amalia, but at how thoroughly her absence was engineered. The price of protecting the Whitney legacy was paid in the obliteration of any document that might prove she had ever been promised a share. The family's power did not end at the edge of their lawns. It extended into the systems meant to guard the truth. Editors received quiet visits, archivists were offered donations contingent on discretion, and minor officials learned that certain questions were simply not asked about certain names. And yet, as is often the case in stories we explore here at Beyond the Golden Halls, the attempt at perfect erasure was not entirely successful. The very report written by that former clerk exists because his conscience, or perhaps his weariness, finally outweighed his training in obedience. He wrote it late in life, his handwriting unsteady, describing nights when the furnace roared louder than the city outside and papers marked AW curled and blackened in the orange light. He does not claim heroism. He admits he fed the flames, but he also admits he looked away. Only once the ink had vanished, as if unable to watch the last traces of her name disappear. Somewhere, among the remaining Whitney papers in private hands, there is said to be a single sheet that escaped those fires, a carbon copy of an inventory listing documents destroyed by order, followed by a date and a list of categories: personal correspondence, early draft testamentary instruments, schedule of proposed settlements. Next to one of those lines, in different ink, a later hand has added, a brief note. All matters relating to AW now closed. No explanation, no apology. Just that small, precise sentence, sitting there like an object out of place in an otherwise orderly record. Imagine holding that page now, feeling the thinness of the paper, the indentation of those final initials. The official Whitney histories will tell you there was no scandal, no hidden heir, no broken promise worth mentioning. The family portraits will show perfect, uncluttered branches of a proud lineage. But that single annotation, those two letters attached to a list of things burned long ago, contradicts the silence as surely as if Amalia herself had stepped back into the room. It waits at the bottom of the page, under a column of carefully itemized absences, like a door no one admitted was there, outlined only by the faint pressure of a hand that tried, and failed, to write her out of existence forever. For a long time, the story of Amalia Whitney sounds like a struggle between one woman and the cold machinery of a dynasty, until you look closer at the other women moving quietly at the edges of the frame. In the drawing rooms and upstairs sitting parlors of the Gilded Age, alliances were not only forged over cigars and brandy, they were stitched together in whispered conversations between sisters, cousins, and married daughters, their gloved hands resting on embroidered cushions while they calculated futures no one would ever admit had been calculated. The Whitney women knew the rules of succession as well as any lawyer. They knew which marriages had strengthened the family's position, which brothers needed more support to maintain the facade of success, which branches of the tree were useful, and which were inconvenient. Amalia, with her inadequate marriage and her refusal to behave like a piece in someone else's game, stood at an angle that disturbed the composition, and composition mattered in those Golden Age secrets more than truth ever would. It is in this context that a letter surfaces, a single, unassuming piece of paper folded into the back of a velvet-lined box, written in a hand that imitates perfect calm. The author is one of Amalia's sisters, now married into another railroad fortune, her new name appearing frequently in the society pages. On the surface, the letter is almost affectionate. She writes about the weather in Newport, about a charity concert, about the gowns ordered from Paris. But between these carefully chosen details, a different conversation unfolds. She notes that father grows tired of contention and that, for the peace of the household, it would be best if certain expectations were adjusted. She mentions a meeting with the family attorney in a way that sounds incidental, yet lists the names of 3 male relatives who were present, all of them beneficiaries of the revised arrangements. A sentence near the middle, underlined twice in her own ink, reads, "It has been agreed that it would not be wise for you to insist upon terms that no longer reflect your station. No threats, no raised voice, just a quiet assertion that Amalia's place has already been decided, and that the women who once shared her nursery now stand on the other side of the ledger." The habits of the elite American households make these dynamics almost visible. In winter, the Whitney ladies gathered in a particular upstairs room, the one with the narrow fireplace and the low table always laid out with correspondence trays. Visitors described it as cozy, but in the reports and memoirs that survive, you notice how often serious matters were referred to the ladies after the men had agreed on broad principles. A brother could hardly admit in public that he wanted his sister discredited. A married daughter, however, could easily suggest that another woman's behavior had become unreliable or emotionally distressing in letters and conversations that never entered the official record. In that sense, the women around Amalia were both constrained and powerful, navigating forbidden rooms of influence where a glance withheld at a ball or a failed invitation spoke louder than any published accusation. The sister's letter reveals this choreography with unnerving clarity. She mentions having spoken with Aunt C about limiting certain social exposures, and notes, with chilling neatness, that there is some concern that your continued assertion of claims may be interpreted as instability in a society where a woman's reputation could be turned with a phrase. The word instability placed in the right ears could do more damage than any courtroom defeat. Behind this language sits the fear that runs through so many of these hidden heirs stories, the terror of scandal, not only among men in boardrooms, but among the women whose own positions depended on projecting perfection. For Amalia's sisters and cousins, her existence as a disinherited daughter married below her station was not just a moral question. It was a potential crack in the polished surface they had spent years tending. A whisper that one Whitney girl married poorly and then fought for money could, in their minds, bleed into "the Whitneys are in disarray," a phrase that could unsettle bankers and suitors alike. The letter hints at this unspoken calculus. You must understand that we too have households to maintain, and that father's name must not be dragged into unpleasant discussions. The phrasing slides smoothly from we to father, fusing personal comfort with dynastic preservation. In protecting the family's status, they also protect their own drawing rooms, their own places at the edge of the ballroom, their own children's future matches. The price is paid once again in Amalia. From a historian's perspective, this single piece of correspondence feels like the missing hinge in the case. It confirms that what happened to Amalia was not an impersonal legal adjustment, not a clerical error or a misunderstanding between lawyers. It was a deliberate act, discussed in parlors and over tea, carried out in part by those who might have been expected to defend her. The letter's physical presence only deepens the atmosphere, the paper slightly stiff from age, the ink browned at the edges, a faint trace of perfume long since turned sour. When you turn it toward the light, you can see where the pen hesitated over certain words, as if even in private, the writer was aware that some sentences might live longer than she wanted. Near the end, she writes, "I hope you will be wise enough to accept the arrangements and spare us further distress." The word "us" sits there like a wall, separating Amalia from a family that now defines itself without her. This is where the question turns outward for a moment, toward you, as it often does on this channel. Holding a letter like this, knowing what you know now about Gilded Age families and the way they buried their inconvenient truths, you have to ask, what would you do if you found something like this buried in the Gilded Age? Would you treat it as a curiosity, a relic of another era, and slide it back into its box? Or would you see in that careful, looping handwriting the shape of a conspiracy that deserves to be pulled into the light, even if everyone directly involved has long since gone silent? These are not easy questions, and the archives do not answer them for us. They only offer paper, ink, and the small betrayals recorded in both. The discovery of the letter also changes how we read the rest of the record. Suddenly, small details take on new weight. A diary entry by a cousin noting that E has grown anxious about the A situation. A cryptic line in a banker's notebook about reallocation approved by the ladies. A notation in a social column that refers to one of the sisters as the true hostess of the Whitney circle, as if a crown had been passed internally. The logic of herança e successão in that house did not operate only through legal formulas. It moved along lines of gossip, favor, and exclusion, controlled in large part by the women who decided who was welcome and who was quietly left standing at the edge of the carpet. In that light, the destruction of Amalia's records, the erasure of her name from official papers, begins to look less like a single act of patriarchal authority and more like a group project, sustained over years by people who had learned that survival in this world meant aligning with the winning story. For the Whitney sisters and their allies, the cost of aligning with that story rarely appears on the surface. They continue to appear at charity balls, to sit for portraits, to host afternoons of music and conversation. In photographs taken in the years after the disputed inheritance, their posture is perfect, their gloved hands resting elegantly on chair arms or fans. Yet when you look at those images knowing what the letter contains, small details begin to disturb the composition. The way one sister's gaze slides slightly away from the camera, the tightness at the corner of a mouth, the way a hand grips the back of another's chair just a little too firmly. These are not proofs in a legal sense, but they are part of the atmosphere of silent witnesses and dark legacy that surrounds the case. In the end, the sister's letter does more than accuse. It exposes the shape of the game being played. It shows how Golden Age secrets were maintained not only by editing documents and controlling newspapers, but by teaching women to see each other as instruments of preservation. The sister pleads for peace while endorsing Amalia's exclusion, invokes duty while accepting a share of the inheritance that was once meant to be shared more widely. That tension, between the language of care and the reality of sacrifice, is the quiet cruelty at the heart of many hidden heirs stories. When the letter is finally placed back among the other papers, it rests against a small framed photograph that has survived in the same box. A group of young Whitney women on a terrace dressed in summer white, faces turned toward the sun. On the glass, over one of the figures in the middle, a faint, deliberate scratch runs across the features, just enough to blur the expression without erasing the outline. No caption identifies which sister stood there. The mark catches the light when you tilt the picture, a thin, pale line where a face should be, and for a long moment, the silence around that scratched-out gaze feels heavier than anything the documents have yet dared to say. The path to the truth in Gilded Age mansions rarely runs in a straight line. It doubles back through stairwells, slips behind paneling, and sometimes ends where the architect pretended there was nothing at all. In the Whitney case, that path leads to a room that technically did not exist, a space absent from the official plans but hinted at in one fragile piece of paper you've already seen, a floor sketch with a doorway penciled in and then rubbed almost completely away. For years, that erased door felt like a metaphor, another symbol in a story full of forbidden rooms and silent witnesses. It only became literal when, during a mid-20th century renovation, a carpenter tapped on a section of oak paneling in the old library and heard a sound that did not match the rest of the wall. The wood rang hollow. Behind it, there was more house. The discovery at first looked like the kind of thing contractors love to tell as an anecdote. A hidden closet, perhaps, a remnant of some forgotten remodel. But when the panel was pried loose, what emerged was not a wardrobe or a dusty trunk of costumes. It was a narrow passage leading to a small, windowless room lined in cold plaster. In the center of the far wall stood a steel safe, bolted to the floor, its surface dulled by decades of still air. The safe was not part of any later addition. Its design and maker's mark put it firmly in the late 19th century, the apex of the Gilded Age, when fortunes like the Whitneys demanded vaults not only in banks, but inside their own houses, for gold, for bonds, and for Golden Age secrets that could never be entrusted to outsiders. Opening a safe like that is never as cinematic as the movies want it to be. There was no stethoscope, no dramatic cracking sound, just a modern locksmith with power tools and patience, flakes of metal falling like dust onto the library floor. When the door finally swung a few inches, the breath of trapped air that escaped carried the dry, unmistakable smell of old paper, iron, and something faintly chemical. Inside, there were no jewels, no stacks of coins, nothing that would have impressed a thief. There were only bundles of documents tied with discolored ribbon, their edges uneven, their ink half faded. For the purposes of this story, they were far more valuable than any treasure. They were records the Whitneys had gone to great lengths to erase everywhere else. Among the first items removed were multiple drafts of Henry Whitney's will, each one bearing the date of some key year in the family's ascent. You could line them up and watch the dark legacy of the estate play out across the paper, early versions that list all children by name, including my daughter Amalia H., with a clearly defined share. Later versions that replace her with vague references to issue as herein designated. Final, notarized pages where her existence disappears entirely. What makes the safe's content so unsettling is not just that these earlier drafts survived, but that they were preserved together with the documents that contradict them. In one bundle, a fair copy of a will showing Amalia's inheritance is tied with the same ribbon as a legal memorandum advising substitution of beneficiary, and a private letter noting that all parties have now consented, whether formally or by necessity. It is as if someone gathered every version of the truth and locked them side by side, choosing secrecy over destruction. Of all the papers inside that hidden vault, the most disturbing are the letters that give Amalia back her voice. There are 3 preserved in her hand, each written on the kind of monogrammed stationery a Whitney daughter would have used, the crest pressed into the top of the page. She writes to the family attorney, to one of her brothers, and, in the longest letter, to her father himself. The tone is not hysterical or self-pitying. It is measured, precise, the language of a woman who understands both the law and the unwritten rules of her world. She refers calmly to the provisions initially made for me, cites dates of meetings, mentions by name the bankers and lawyers who had once assured her of her position. Between the lines, you can feel the weight of those erased records, the way her life has been rearranged on paper without her consent. She does not beg, she insists. For anyone who has traced Gilded Age inheritance disputes through court files, these letters feel like something that slipped through a crack in the system. Cases like this rarely reached public proceedings because families like the Whitneys understood how damaging such fights could be. Instead, they negotiated in back rooms, used pressure and persuasion, and, when necessary, silence. The safe contains evidence of exactly that process. A draft of a family settlement agreement marked "not for filing," where Amalia is offered a lump sum in full satisfaction of all claims, present and future, on the condition that she sign a release and refrain from further attempts to assert her rights. The amount is generous enough to appear fair to outside eyes, but when you compare it to the size of the estate detailed in other documents, railroad stocks, steel interests, urban property, it reads more like a payment for invisibility than an inheritance. There are signs that Amalia resisted. One margin note in the lawyer's hand summarizes a conversation in which she declines to accept the terms as presently framed, pointing out that the proposal does not secure anything for her issue, her potential children. Another memorandum, initialed by a senior Whitney, instructs the attorney to impress upon her the social consequences of continued agitation. The phrase sits on the page like a threat dressed in polite clothing. A later draft of the settlement, however, includes a clause that changes everything, a provision for a trust to be established quietly, not in her name, but in the name of a separate entity that could be disassociated from the Whitney genealogy. It is a compromise that reveals how far the family was willing to bend the logic of herança y sucession to keep their official lineage intact while still buying a measure of peace. The presence of these documents inside a secret house vault raises questions about who chose to preserve them and why. If the goal was complete erasure, why not burn them? Along with the other papers consigned to the basement furnace? One possibility, suggested by a few penciled annotations in a smaller, shakier hand, is that someone within the family was unwilling to let the truth disappear entirely. A later note beside a copy of the settlement reads, "For my understanding, this is what was actually done." Another, beneath Amalia's signature on the release, says simply, "She did not have a choice." These comments do not change the outcome, but they turn the safe into something stranger than a mere hiding place. It becomes a confession room, a forbidden archive where the official story is contradicted, page after page, in ink no public archivist was ever meant to see. The logic behind such a vault fits neatly into the habits of the elite American households of the time. Rich families were notorious for maintaining multiple layers of record-keeping, polished genealogies for public consumption, sanitized files for lawyers and banks, and private caches where the truly dangerous material was kept under lock and key. Salas secretas and hidden safes held not just jewels and bearer bonds, but letters that could ruin a reputation, contracts that revealed how fragile certain alliances had been, and notes about hidden heirs whose existence would upset carefully constructed narratives. For the Whitneys, the cofre secreto seems to have served exactly this purpose, concentrating their most potent contradictions in one forbidden room that could be sealed, literally, behind a wall. As you turn these papers over in your mind, you can't help circling the same questions that haunt so many Golden Age secrets. Was the safe built to protect the documents from prying eyes outside the family, or from conscience inside it? Did the same hands that ordered the destruction of Amalia's public records also instruct that these private copies be preserved, just in case? Or did someone, years later, quietly rescue them from the fire and relocate them here? Choosing secrecy over obliteration, there is no memo that answers that. There is only the atmosphere of guilt that seems to cling to the edges of the pages, the small pauses in the handwriting, the places where a sentence stops abruptly, as if the writer could not bring themselves to finish the thought. What the coffre reveals, beyond the facts of the settlement, is the scale of the bargain that underpinned the Whitney empire. Protecting the family's image required more than deleting a name from a will. It demanded the active dismantling of one woman's future and the careful packaging of that act into paperwork that could be buried in both senses of the word. The hidden heirs of the Gilded Age were not always denied because there was no money. They were denied because acknowledging them would have forced these families to admit that their own rules could be bent, broken, or challenged. Keeping Amalia officially erased allowed the Whitneys to present their wealth as clean, inevitable. Unbroken, a single safe full of forbidden documents says otherwise. As more of the vault's contents are cataloged, the connection between Amalia's destruction and the preservation of the Whitney legacy becomes harder to ignore. A chart showing the flow of assets after the settlement places her former share directly behind key investments that stabilize the family at a critical moment. A note from a banker praises the unity and firmness with which the Whitneys resolved internal misunderstandings. In other words, the same act that erased her from history helped secure the image of a strong, undivided dynasty that would dominate the era's headlines and philanthropic projects. The silent witnesses to that transaction are not only the clerks and attorneys, but the very documents locked in this room, testaments to a truth that lived in the dark while a different story shone in public. By the time you reach the back of the safe, past the larger bundles and official papers, a smaller flat package surfaces, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Inside it, there is no letterhead, no legal language, just a single sheet of thinner stationery, folded once. On it, in faded ink, appears a list of names and dates written in a woman's hand: births, marriages, small notes like "moved to Boston" or "returned from Europe." At the bottom, just above the empty space where another entry might have gone, there is one more line: Amalia, terms accepted for sake of peace. The words have been struck through with a firm line, as if someone later decided even that admission was too much. The paper remains, the indentation of the letters still visible if you tilt it toward the light. In that scratched-out sentence at the very bottom of a forgotten page, the dark legacy of the Whitney inheritance gathers itself into a single, fragile point of tension, waiting, after all these decades, for someone to notice that even here, where everything was meant to be controlled, her name refused to disappear quietly. When you start following the money instead of the names, the story of Amalia Whitney's missing inheritance sharpens into something colder and more precise. In the neat columns of the Whitney ledgers, there is a moment where a red line crosses through one set of figures and reappears in another, like blood diverted from one vein to feed a different part of the body. On one page, under an early date, a column of dividends is clearly associated with AHW. In a later book, same assets, same amounts, same payment dates, the heading has changed. The income now flows to a different branch entirely, under the name of a cousin whose importance has been quietly rising in the background of this Gilded Age drama. He appears first in the record as almost an afterthought. A cousin E, invited to join a board, a younger man representing the cadet branch at a railway negotiation. His surname elongated by a hyphen that reflects a profitable marriage into another industrial family. On paper, he is exactly the sort of heir a dynasty like the Whitneys prefers to highlight. His money is recent enough to carry momentum, his connections broad enough to stabilize risky ventures, his social standing strengthened by a wife whose last name looks good in the society columns. When the panic of 1893 shakes the markets and tested fortunes begin to wobble, it is this cousin's line of credit, not Henry Whitney's alone, that keeps certain projects from collapsing. Bankers make notes praising his steady hand, and in private correspondence between law partners, you see him described as a most suitable consolidating figure. In that world, suitability can be more valuable than blood. The logic of heranza e successo in the Whitney house, already warped by alliances and silent agreements, bends a little further in his direction. The cofre secreto in the forbidden room yields evidence of how deliberate that bend was. Among the bundles of documents pulled from the safe, there is a series of charts prepared by the family's financial advisors, each one outlining different scenarios for asset rationalization. In one version, Amalia's original portion is maintained, and the family must carry more debt to support the cousin's ventures. In another, her share is reduced, freeing capital to shore up his position. A third, marked in a darker ink and circled twice, shows her entirely removed, her prospective trust now fueling a consolidated block of voting stock under his control. Next to that final diagram, someone has written, in small, cramped script, "Preferred, ensures stability and unity. The transfer itself is executed with a series of transactions that look, on the surface, like any other Gilded Age rebalancing. Certificates are reissued in the cousin's name. A trust once labeled simply "for daughter" is quietly dissolved, its contents flowing into a new instrument described as serving the long-term interests of the family. A memorandum sent to the bank instructs that all future correspondence regarding these assets be directed to the cousin's office rather than the Whitney residence. The language throughout is clinical, almost anesthetic. There are no references to Amalia, no acknowledgments that what is being redirected was once promised elsewhere. If you didn't know there had been another intended heir, you would never guess from these pages that anything was missing. Outside the ledgers, however, traces of the shift show up in more human ways. Within a few years of the transfer, the cousin's name begins appearing with new prominence. A hospital wing bears his surname. A subscription list for a museum records a donation large enough to place him on a plaque alongside Henry himself. At a charity ball, a reporter notes that Mr. E.W. was much deferred to in discussions of railway developments as one whose decisions now carry considerable weight. The phrasing is casual, but behind it lies the reality that, thanks in part to Amalia's erased records, he now speaks with a voice funded by money that once followed a different path. Inside the family, the redistribution leaves its own marks, mostly visible in what people do not say directly. Letters between siblings hint at E's growing influence and the new balance among us. A married sister writes to a friend that our cousin now carries a burden father once assumed alone, then adds in a smaller hand, some of us carry the cost of this more quietly than others. At dinners, seating patterns shift. The cousin is placed closer to the head of the table, consulted on matters that once would have gone exclusively to Henry. A junior relative, noting the change in a diary, describes an evening where the elders talk of prudence, unity, sacrifice, in tones that sound more like justification than celebration. From the vantage point of a century later, with access to both public archives and the forbidden rooms of private papers, the pattern is painfully clear. The decision to route Amalia's inheritance into this cousin's hands was not a matter of oversight or accident. It was a calculated move to reinforce the dynasty at a moment when its foundations trembled. Hidden heirs have a way of complicating narratives. A disinherited daughter who insists on her rights can delay mergers, frighten investors, draw unwanted press. A suitable cousin, by contrast, can be presented as a stabilizing force, a reassuring figure for bankers and newspaper readers alike. The Whitney elders chose the path that kept their image clean, even as it deepened the dark legacy sealed inside their walls. The press, as always in the Gilded Age, plays its part. When rumors begin to circulate about internal disputes within the Whitney circle, friendly editors are given a different story to print. A profile of the cousin as the modern face of the Whitney interests, emphasizing his diligence, his sense of responsibility, his devotion to family tradition. The article speaks vaguely of adjustments made after Henry's death, framed as acts of wisdom that allowed the family to weather difficult times. There is no mention of any daughter, no suggestion that those adjustments involved subtracting a life from the balance sheet. To the public, the narrative is one of strength and continuity. In the Cofre Secreto, the erased records tell another version. Even the official genealogies adjust to accommodate this new reality. In later editions commissioned by the family, the cousin's branch is given more elaborate treatment. Portraits, extended biographical notes, descriptions of his public works. Footnotes refer to him as instrumental in preserving the family holdings through periods of financial unrest. The sentence is technically accurate, but it leaves out the mechanism. It does not say that part of what he preserved was acquired by redirecting what had been set aside for someone else. Silent witnesses in the text, commas, omissions, euphemisms, do the work of smoothing over the violence done on paper. For those inside the family who still carried a private memory of Amalia's claim, the new order creates a subtler kind of fracture. Resentments and rivalries appear not in shouted accusations, but in the way invitations are extended or withheld. A niece raised on stories of Aunt A who went her own way smiles too tightly when the cousin's name is praised. A younger generation, curious and just far enough removed from the original scandal, asks quiet questions about why certain lines of descent seem less well provided for than others. The answers they receive are vague. Circumstances, unfortunate choices, matters best left in the past. The past, however, has a habit of leaving objects behind. One of those objects sits today in a museum case, labeled simply as a gift from the Whitney estate. It is a heavy silver cigarette case, engraved with a new, intertwined monogram. At some point, a curator decided the letters represented the cousin and his wife, and the catalog reflects that assumption. Under the glass, though, if you lean close and watch how the light catches the metal, you can see that the original engraving was altered. The first set of letters, now faint, appears to form an A and a W, the curves partially effaced by later work. The newer initials have been cut over them with brutal precision, claiming the surface as thoroughly as. The cousin's ledger entries claim the income once promised to Amália. No label mentions this. The official description speaks only of craftsmanship and provenance. It is that cigarette case, a small, polished artifact contradicting the smooth version of events, that hangs in the air at the end of this part of the story. On the records, the transfer of fortune looks orderly, justified, almost mathematical. In the photographs and society pages, the cousin appears as a pillar of stability, the man who helped carry the Whitney name safely into the new century. But on the back of the glass, where no visitor is meant to look, the shadow of another monogram lingers, lines half erased but still stubbornly visible, like a name crossed out in ink that refuses to fade, asking, quietly, insistently, who, exactly, decided that one future was worth more than another. By the time you reach the last bundles from the cofre secreto and the scattered traces in law firm archives, one question hangs over. Everything like dust in a shaft of light. If Amalia's inheritance was taken from her, what happened to what little she did manage to hold on to? In Gilded Age, New York, even a disinherited daughter could accumulate something. Personal jewelry, a modest settlement, a small portfolio structured to keep her quiet. The empire might pretend she had been erased, but the law still demanded that when she died, someone sign their name beneath the words, last will and testament. The official record insists. There was nothing unusual about her passing, a slim notice in the paper, a brief entry in the probate docket, the bland phrase, intestate, implying that she left no directions of her own. It is the kind of sentence that allows everyone to move on without questions. But inside the deeper files of a long-defunct law firm, in a box that should have been pulped with the rest, another document waited in the dark. It comes to light not in a grand revelation, but in the quiet work of an archivist, sorting through what was thought to be routine material, unindexed packets of correspondence, old envelopes from safety deposit vaults, brittle carbon copies. One folder, tied with a narrow strip of faded blue ribbon, carries a label so generic it almost guarantees invisibility. Miss Testamentary, unfiled. The handwriting is from the early 20th century, the kind of quick, slanting script clerks used when they were sure no client would ever see the words. Inside, among a handful of minor codicils and revoked drafts, there is a document written on heavy cream paper bearing a familiar crest. The heading is formal and unambiguous, Last Will and Testament of Amalia H. Whitney. The date places it late in her life, after the settlement that redirected her share into other hands, but before the cousin's assent was fully secured. Someone at some point had taken the time to sit with her at a desk, uncapped a bottle of ink, and watched her begin to write herself back into the story. The will is not long, but it is precise in ways that bite through the years. Amália acknowledges, in careful phrases, the arrangements already made under prior family agreements, language that nods toward the truth without reopening the wound on paper. Then she turns, quietly and firmly, to what remains within her control. She lists a modest portfolio of securities, things that could easily have been overlooked in the larger game: shares in a smaller rail concern, a block of stock in a steel supplier, some municipal bonds. Taken together, they represent a fraction of what she was originally promised, but still a meaningful sum to anyone outside the gilded world. Instead of leaving these to any Whitney, she directs them elsewhere. A hospital that treated women in reduced circumstances, a scholarship fund to educate girls whose fathers labor in our industries, a small annuity for a former maid whose name appears here for the first time in the entire case. There is nothing dramatic. In the language, no accusation. The quiet radicalism lies in the fact that she deliberately steers this last current of wealth away from the channels her family had spent decades reinforcing. What gives the document its charge is not only what she does with her remaining assets, but how explicitly she frames the decision. In one clause, she writes that these bequests are made in lieu of any claim I might once have asserted within my own family, a sentence that stands like a ghostly rebuttal to the sanitized genealogies and silent ledgers. She does not describe herself as a victim. Instead, she records, in the formal language of a Gilded Age testatrix, that there was, in fact, something to which she might have laid claim, and that since that road was barred, she chooses another path for what is left in her hands. Between the lines, you can almost see her at the writing table, the way her pen pauses before certain phrases, the slight tilt where she leans harder into a word like once, the way her signature at the bottom stretches a little longer than the space allotted, as if refusing to be contained neatly within the margin. Legally, for a will to matter in that era, it had to be more than written. It had to be witnessed, lodged in the right places, brought before a court after death. The back of Amalia's testament bears 3 signatures in addition to her own: 2 clerks and a neighbor from the building where she spent her later years, all testifying that she signed in their presence. The formalities are there. On its face, this document should have walked straight into the court record, challenging the assumption that she died intestate, forcing the system to acknowledge her last choices. Yet the probate file says otherwise. When she died, someone presented a different narrative to the surrogate's court, that there was no will, that her modest estate would be distributed according to default rules, which, in the structure the Whitneys had carefully arranged, meant that most of what she still controlled flowed back toward the same cousin and his branch. The clerk's docket shows a brief hearing, no objections, no mention of any alternative instructions. Somewhere between the desk where she signed and the bench where the judge sat, her final words fell into a gap. The gap is where the Gilded Age habits of encobrimento and control reappear. Tucked into the folder with the will is a short covering note written in the law firm's hand addressed to a senior partner whose name appears throughout the Whitney files. The note states, in language that is almost apologetic, that Miss A.H. Whitney has executed the attached instrument disposing of her personal estate, and asks for guidance on whether, in view of prior family settlements, it is advisable to proceed with formal lodging. Across the bottom of the page, in a different ink and a more authoritative script, someone has written a single word: hold. No explanation, no follow-up instructions. Just that one syllable, suspended like a verdict. The will, duly prepared and witnessed, never moved beyond the firm's internal files. Amalia died believing she had done what the law required to direct her small remaining fortune toward the people and causes she chose. The machinery around her decided that those wishes were inconvenient, perhaps even dangerous, and quietly kept the paper in a drawer. The implications of that act reach beyond one woman's estate. In the Gilded Age, the last will and testament was not just a legal instrument, it was a final assertion of agency in a world where, for women especially, so much of life was dictated by others. Families like the Whitneys understood that a will could become, if anyone wished, a weapon, a document that named wrongs, favored unexpected heirs, diverted funds to institutions that reflected values the dynasty did not share. Suppressing Amalia's testament meant more than redirecting a modest sum. It meant ensuring that no public record would ever show that she had consciously chosen to send Whitney wealth away from Whitney hands. The dark legacy of the house required that she remain not only disinherited but voiceless. This is where the question turns to you, the listener moving with us through these forbidden rooms and silent witnesses. Would you have the courage to access a file like this, to call up a sealed box from the depths of an archive, and unfold a document that contradicts everything the official histories insist is true? It is one thing to suspect that a hidden heir was treated unjustly. It is another to hold in your hands the exact paragraphs where she tried, one last time, to write her own ending, and to know that people, named respectable, praised in their obituaries, chose to pretend those paragraphs did not exist. The weight of the paper in that moment is not just physical. It is the weight of all the stories that never made it into the family narrative because they did not serve the image on the front steps. As the archivist slides the will back into its folder, one last detail catches the light. In the upper corner of the first page, where clerks typically stamp the word "filed" once a document enters the system, there is a faint pencil outline of that very word, the letters sketched but never inked. Someone at some point positioned a stamp there, hesitated, and then set it aside. Later, perhaps to indicate that the matter was closed in another way, a clerk drew a single diagonal line through the heading, "Last Will and Testament of Amalia H. Whitney," turning the title into something that looks at a glance like it has been canceled. The ink has faded, but the groove of the stroke is still visible when you run a finger lightly over the page. In that thin, slanting mark, cutting across the one place where her will should have been undeniable, the silence of the Whitney story gathers again and waits, as if the scratch itself were a door in the record that no one ever meant you to see. If you only read the polished genealogies and the society page tributes, you would think the Whitney story moved in a graceful upward line. More houses, more endowments, more portraits in carved frames. It is only when you lay the financial reports from the first decades of the 20th century side by side with the erased records of Amalia's case that another pattern emerges, as jagged as a crack running through marble. On paper, the decision to strip her of her inheritance and funnel it into the more suitable cousin's hands looked like a masterstroke of Gilded Age prudence. The consolidated block of stock steadied key ventures, soothed nervous bankers, and for a time even enlarged the cousin's public aura as the savior of the Whitney interests. But fortunes in that era were balanced like elaborate table settings, one glass misplaced, one plate removed, and the whole composition began to list. The branches of the family that had expected Amalia's share to offset their own more modest positions found themselves suddenly exposed. Brothers and nephews who had quietly assumed that, when father is gone, Amalia's portion will even us all out, watched as the redirection hardened into reality and their own ledgers stayed thin. In departmental budgets, in reduced allowances, in the quiet sale of a summer house no one admitted they could no longer afford, the impact of her exclusion registered not as a moral victory, but as a slow, grinding loss. The internal reports, never meant for the public and now yellowed at the edges, capture these tremors in numbers and phrases that sound bloodless until you read them in context. One memorandum to the family council notes that certain collateral lines show increasing strain, recommending temporary assistance that never quite arrives. Charts prepared by accountants, small firms, not the grand Wall Street houses, show income from core assets flowing disproportionately toward the cousin's investments, leaving other branches dependent on diminishing rents and aging properties. A nephew trying to establish himself in a newer industry is denied backing with the explanation that family resources are fully engaged. A sentence that, in the margins, carries a pencil note: see reallocations following AHW settlement. At dinners in the main house, this imbalance translates into something more atmospheric. A younger son enters the drawing room in a suit that is just slightly too shiny from repeated pressing. Stands behind an armchair a moment too long before finding a place where no one has to move aside. His wife laughs a little too loudly at the cousin's jokes. the sound bouncing off paneling designed for more measured voices. No one says, "You stand where you stand because of Amalia." But the arrangement of chairs and the weight of the glances do that work quietly, night after night. In a class obsessed with appearances, these internal fractures are both dangerous and carefully managed. The Whitney elders had always known that the power of their name depended on presenting a united front to the world. No open feuds, no lawsuits between cousins, no public acknowledgement that the Golden Age secrets inside their forbidden rooms ever translated into actual harm. So when the strain began to show, they did what such families had always done. They smoothed, they hosted, they posed for photographs that telegraphed harmony, even as private letters turned sharp. One granddaughter, writing from Europe, describes returning to find the atmosphere chillier, as if everyone had been scolded and no one could quite say why. She notes the way conversations change subject abruptly when a particular cousin enters. The way a remark about how fortunate we are hangs in the air a beat too long. A later letter from the same hand adds, "We are all meant to be grateful to E for preserving the estate, but there are rooms now where his name cannot be spoken without a certain silence after." Ironically, the very move meant to secure the Whitney legacy exposed it to new vulnerabilities. By concentrating so much of the family's weight on one branch, the elders tied their fortunes to the cousins' judgment in ways they would once have avoided. When he backed a series of aggressive expansions just before another market downturn, the buffers that might have come from a more evenly distributed structure were no longer there. Smaller lines of the family, already strained, found themselves drawn into guarantees they had not fully understood, their signatures added to documents they were assured were mere formalities. When a later panic hit and some of these ventures faltered, it was not only the cousins' lifestyle that shuddered, it was the ability of other Whitneys to maintain the facades that had defined them. Houses once thought unassailable went onto quiet markets. A carriage emblazoned with the family crest appeared suddenly, and then no more, in front of certain churches. Former servants met in the street switched to less formal greetings as the hierarchy they had always recognized began to blur. From the outside, none of this looked like a collapse. The Whitney name continued to appear on museum walls and hospital plaques. Newspapers still described them as one of the great dynasties of American industry. But inside, the moral cost of what had been done to Amalia began to show up in small acts of resistance and retreat. One branch, quietly disgusted, sent its children abroad and married them into families that owed nothing to Whitney steel or rail. Another turned inward, retreating to a country estate, hosting fewer guests, allowing the city house to decay just enough that invitations ceased to be expected. An elderly aunt, no longer constrained by the need to impress suitors, kept a photograph of a young woman on her dressing table and refused to explain the choice when asked. On the back, in pencil, someone had once written A, only the initial, as if even at that distance the full name was risky. In the ledgers, the impact of these choices registers as lost opportunities, failed consolidations, projects that never quite launched. In the archives, it registers as gaps, years where fewer letters are saved, where an entire side of the family disappears from the correspondence of the others. The dark legacy of the decision to erase Amalia does not end with her settlement or even with the suppression of her own will. It ripples outward, undermining the very unity that the elders had claimed to be protecting. The silent witnesses in this phase are not just clerks and lawyers. They are the unused guest rooms, the stripped greenhouses, the shuttered music rooms whose pianos are never tuned because there is no longer money or appetite for constant entertainment. Looking back with the benefit of distance, historians sometimes speak of the rise and decline of the great Gilded Age dynasties as if these were natural cycles. Impersonal economic forces pressing on families who simply happened to be in their path. The Whitney papers, especially when you include the Forbidden Room documents and the erased records surrounding Amalia, complicate that comfort. They suggest that some of the damage was self-inflicted, the product of choices made in wood-paneled studies where reputation was valued above justice and short-term stability above a more honest, if messier, Distribution of power. The decision to sacrifice one member for the appearance of unity did not only harm her, it planted a fissure in the foundation that widened with every subsequent generation, even when no one spoke her name. By the mid-century, when the house with the hidden safe was finally sold and the cofre secreto inadvertently exposed, the Whitney descendants who walked through those rooms did so with a curious mix of entitlement and unease. A few of them paused longer than others in front of certain portraits, tracing frames with their eyes, noticing, perhaps without fully understanding, that there were spaces on the walls where canvases had once hung and now did not. One inventory prepared for the sale lists a large oil painting, family group year 1885, as missing, presumed destroyed. The line stands out because someone has drawn a question mark next to the word missing, as if even at that late date, the absence still bothered them. Somewhere there must be a photograph of that picture, taken before it vanished, a posed arrangement of Whitneys on a terrace or in a formal parlor, all the recognized heirs in their proper places. If you look closely at the blurred reproduction tucked into a file, you can just make out a narrow gap between two figures where another person might once have stood, the ghost of a skirt or a sleeve cropped by the edge of the frame. No caption explains who was edited out or why. The official catalog calls it damage. In the long shadow of Amalia's story, that thin, empty space feels less like damage and more like a confession the family never quite meant to leave behind. The irony is that the work the Whitneys did to bury Amalia is exactly what makes it possible to find her now. If they had treated her like any other minor relative, left her a token sum, mentioned her politely in the printed genealogies, she would have dissolved into the background of the Gilded Age like so many forgotten daughters. Instead, they turned her into an absence so sharp it left a mark. For decades, that mark lived in footnotes and question marks, archivists puzzling over missing files, local historians noting unexplained gaps in property transfers, a graduate student scribbling "Who is AHW?" in the margin of a copied ledger. None of them alone could see the whole shape. It is only now, with multiple archives digitized, law firm remnants cataloged, house inventories scanned and cross-referenced, that the erased records begin to align like fragments of a torn photograph, sliding together across a light table. The reevaluation doesn't start with a grand revelation. It begins, as these Golden Age secrets often do, with boredom and curiosity in the stacks. A researcher working on a broader study of hidden heirs and dark legacy stories in American dynasties notices the same initials, AHW, appearing and vanishing across different collections. A clerk's note about suppressed bequest, read daughter A, in a public index that has no corresponding file. A law firm memorandum mentioning prior settlement with Miss A.H. Whitney in a case that is supposedly unrelated. A museum label for a cigarette case whose original monogram doesn't quite match the one in the description. None of it proves anything. Taken together, it suggests the outline of a person who has been pushed to the edge of the page again and again, never quite falling off. What changes the scale of the story is the moment someone decides to treat that outline not as noise, but as a subject. Instead of accepting the Whitney genealogies as complete, they treat them as what they are. Curated narratives crafted by a family with every incentive to polish away their own contradictions. They file requests for internal house inventories, locate the auction catalog from the sale of the Whitney mansion, check the miscellaneous boxes in a municipal archive that a more hurried researcher would ignore. Piece by piece, the forbidden rooms of the past open, not literally this time, but through paper. The cofre secreto records, the sister's compromising letter, the unfiled will. The story that emerges is not just one of a hidden heir, but of a system that preferred to torch truth rather than let it threaten the image on the front steps. In the process, the silence that once surrounded Amalia begins to look less like absence and more like a deliberate instrument. Historians who had previously treated her exclusion as a footnote now see that it intersected with key turning points in the Whitney rise, the consolidation that saved them during a market panic, the philanthropic gestures that cemented their reputation, the internal fractures that later weakened them. Her erased inheritance financed the cousin's ascent. Her suppressed will preserved the illusion of unbroken loyalty. Her missing portrait made room, literally and figuratively, for other faces to dominate the walls. The new investigations don't turn her into a saint. They simply restore her to her proper place in the narrative. Not a troublesome girl who went her own way, but a central figure in a calculated maneuver of power. Outside of the archives, this reinterpretation starts to seep into the way institutions present the Whitney story. A museum that once displayed a portrait of the cousin under a glowing caption, "Architect of the family's modern fortunes," quietly edits its wall text. The label now mentions internal disputes over inheritance and notes that recent research has highlighted the role of a previously marginalized family member, Amalia Whitney, in the history of the estate. The language is cautious, the way such institutions always are when touching money and memory, but the shift is real. A footnote in a journal article becomes a paragraph, then a chapter. Genealogical websites update their trees. Descendants, seeing a name they were never told at the dinner table, begin to ask questions at family reunions that no one is quite prepared to answer. The moral weight of those questions is part of what makes this phase of the story feel so different from the hushed maneuvers of the original Gilded Age. In Amalia's time, the fear was always of scandal, headlines, court cases, whispers in drawing rooms that could kill a match or frighten a banker. In ours, the fear is more diffuse but no less potent. Reputations re-examined, philanthropic legacies reconsidered, the realization that the institutions bearing the Whitney name are, in part, built atop an injustice that never needed to happen. Board members sit around long tables under portraits of mustached men and carefully coiffed women, listening to presentations about historical context and ethical stewardship. Somewhere between the bar graphs and the legal disclaimers, one quiet fact persists. A woman in their own lineage wrote a will that sent her remaining wealth to people and causes their predecessors ignored, and that will was deliberately kept from the light. As Amalia's story moves from footnote to feature, it starts to resonate beyond the Whitney case. Viewers of channels like Beyond the Golden Halls recognize patterns from other episodes. Hidden heirs in other families, forbidden rooms in other houses, the same choreography of burned letters, rewritten wills, manipulated press. The specifics change, different names, different fortunes, different cities, but the structure remains eerily familiar. Wealth and power concentrated in a small circle, dissenting branches pruned, narratives managed. So tightly that the truth has to wait a century and a half to breathe. In that sense, Amalia stops being just one person in one house. She becomes a symbol of how the Gilded Age elite tried to fix the past in place, only to discover that archives and attics have their own kind of memory. The retelling also changes how we see the physical spaces themselves. Tours of former Whitney properties, once content to point out imported marble and French paneling, begin to include mentions of rooms that do not appear on the original plans, and records of a daughter whose portrait is missing from these walls. Visitors stand in libraries where safes once hid forbidden documents, in galleries where a gap between paintings suddenly feels like a question instead of a decorating choice. The phrase "hidden heirs" stops sounding like melodrama and starts to feel like a literal description of how these houses were organized. Who could be shown, who could be spoken of, whose face could hang in the line of sight, and whose had to be painted over. Yet even in this moment of recovery, the story refuses to resolve cleanly. Some descendants embrace the new narrative, funding scholarships in Amalia's name that mirror the clauses in her lost will. Others bristle, arguing that we cannot judge the past by present standards, or insisting that the archives are being misinterpreted. Lawyers worry about precedents, even though the statutes of limitation for any legal redress expired long ago. Curators debate how much to say on wall labels. Every time the name Amalia Whitney is spoken into a microphone or printed in a brochure, It lightly disrupts a century-old choreography of who was allowed to be central and who was relegated to the edge of the frame. For us, walking through this case with the benefit of distance, the tension runs deeper than a single family's discomfort. The recovery of Amalia's memory forces a broader question. How much of what we think we know about the Gilded Age, and about the rise of American dynasties more generally, is built on stories crafted by the winners, with the silent witnesses edited out? If one woman's erased records can so drastically reshape the understanding of a house as well documented as the Whitneys, what else lies in boxes still marked MISC, or in safes that no one has thought to open? The past does not change, but the story we tell about it does, and every hidden heir brought back into focus shifts the balance a little more. By E. The time you return to the image that opened this entire investigation, the floor plan with the faint, rubbed-out doorway, the cofre secreto behind the paneling, the scratched monogram on the silver, the house no longer reads as a simple monument to success. It feels instead like an archive in 3 dimensions, every omission and imperfection a clue. In a small study in one of those former Whitney homes, long since converted to offices, a framed family tree hangs on the wall for decorative effect. The printing is crisp, the names aligned in symmetrical branches that reassure the casual viewer that everything important has been accounted for. Only if you stand close in the right light do you notice that someone, decades ago before the frame was sealed, pressed a faint pencil mark in the margin beside the generation where Amalia should appear. It is not a name, not even an initial, just a short horizontal line, as if a hand hovered there, not quite daring to write more. The glass reflects the room behind you, desks, computers, the soft glow of a screen where her story is finally being told. And under that reflection, that thin, stubborn mark sits where the tree insists there is nothing at all. A quiet, unblinking contradiction that has waited all this time for someone to see it. By now it would be comforting to say that the legacy of Amalia Whitney can be neatly measured in the bonds she lost or the clauses that were crossed out. But what was really hidden runs deeper than any single ledger line. The Gilded Age had a habit of turning manipulation into routine, especially when it came to herança et succession. In houses like the Whitneys, rewriting a will, reassigning a trust, or correcting an inconvenient name in the records was not treated as a moral rupture. It was housekeeping. The surprise, looking back, is not that Amalia was cut out, but how many people had to quietly look away for that erasure to stand. As more testimony surfaces, memoirs, dictated late in life, letters never meant to be mailed, marginal notes left in books that no one thought anyone would read again, you start to see how widely the knowledge of her exclusion was distributed and how deliberately it was ignored. One retired banker, interviewed in the 1940s for an oral history project on New York finance, recalls a meeting around 1900 in which a Whitney representative asked him to disregard prior designations in favor of the newer arrangement. The banker admits that he asked, almost casually, "And the daughter mentioned in earlier drafts?" The answer, he says, came with a small, polite smile and the words, "That matter is settled within the family." He did not push further. The transcript notes a pause, the sound of ice shifting in a glass before he moves on to another topic. In a different collection, a nurse who once worked in one of the family's preferred hospitals describes how a Miss W visited regularly, making donations in memory of a relative whose name was never spoken aloud. The nurse remembers the way the woman's hand lingered on a plaque listing major benefactors, stopping just where there was an empty stretch of bronze wide enough for another name. She looked, the nurse says, as if she were reading something that was not there. Inside the Whitney circle, the awareness of what had been done seems to have settled like dust in the forbidden rooms of their mansions, present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. A family. Council minute, preserved only because it was misfiled under a different date, records a discussion about recent unpleasantness regarding claims from a certain quarter. The speaker assures the others that all legal avenues have been properly closed, but then adds, We must trust one another not to reopen what has been laid to rest. The phrase "trust one another" lands on the page with a weight that feels less like solidarity and more like a pact of silence. Silent witnesses to this dark legacy were not only servants and clerks, they were cousins who chose not to raise the subject at dinner, sisters who folded letters and slipped them into the back of drawers, sons who agreed to inherit without asking too many questions about what or who had been displaced. What was truly hidden then was not only wealth, but complicity. The erased records are proof that documents were altered, suppressed, burned. The testimonies reveal one layer more, that members of the Whitney family looked directly at Amalia's rights and decided they could live with ignoring them. Some did it with reluctance, others with the brisk assurance of people who believed they were protecting something larger than themselves. The name, the estate, our standing. A granddaughter, writing in a private diary in the 1920s, notes that older relatives sometimes lowered their voices when the subject of that earlier generation came up. She mentions overhearing a remark from an aunt. "We did what we had to. You children enjoy the benefits." In the margin, next to that sentence, the granddaughter has penciled a small question mark, nothing more. It sits there like a tiny rebellion on a page, otherwise filled with social engagements and dressmakers' appointments. The social consequences of this collective looking away seeped into the family's values in ways they may not have recognized at the time. Once you have agreed, even silently, that it is acceptable to erase a daughter to save an image, other compromises become easier. Philanthropy can be used to glaze over internal cruelty. Golden Age secrets can be turned into charming anecdotes about colorful ancestors, while the real victims remain unnamed. Press connections, once used to smother an inheritance dispute, can later be deployed to soften stories about reckless sons or failing ventures. The manipulation of one hidden heir becomes the template for handling future crises. Control the narrative, keep disagreements out of the courts, and the papers. Let the forbidden rooms absorb whatever shame cannot be entirely destroyed. In that sense, Amalia's erased inheritance is not just a single injustice. It is the blueprint for the dynasty's moral architecture. Yet even as the Whitneys tried to bury her, the very attempts to hide her left traces that refused to fully disappear. Archivists talk about ghost entries, index cards referencing files that no longer exist, cross-references with nothing on the other end. Amalia haunts the Bavio record like that, an AHW in a banking register whose account line is blank. A church ledger with the baptismal sponsor's name scratched through, leaving enough of the letters to suggest Amalia, if you know to look. A family Bible in which births and deaths are carefully inscribed for every child in Henry's line. Except for one page where the ink has been scrubbed so hard the paper is thinned, the indentation of letters visible if you tilt it in the right light. These are not accidents of time. They are the fingerprints of deliberate manipulation, physical evidence of a collective decision to pretend that what was owed to her never existed. From the perspective of Beyond the Golden Halls, this is where the mystery of what was hidden turns into something larger than a single family's dark legacy. The Whitneys were not unique. Other Gilded Age dynasties used similar methods: rewritten wills, quiet settlements, pressure on clerks and editors to keep their own hidden heirs invisible. What makes the Whitney case so revealing is that the layers of encobramento are unusually dense, allowing us to watch, almost in slow motion, how a lie about inheritance can bleed into a lie about identity, and from there into a lie about what a family stands for. The more they insisted in public on their unity and benevolence, the more elaborate their private efforts had to become to keep the past from contradicting the story. And yet, for all of that, the legacy of Amalia never quite vanished. It persisted in the causes she tried to support in her will, in the faint lines of her erased name, in the discomfort that flickered across relatives' faces when an unexpected question caught them off guard. It lives now in the work of researchers who refuse to accept polished narratives without checking the forgotten folders labeled MISC. In that sense, the question, what was hidden, becomes less about locating a single missing object and more about recognizing a pattern, a way of thinking about money, power and family that prized control over honesty. Every new document that surfaces, every testimony that confirms that, yes, they knew and chose not to act, peels back another layer from that pattern. The story, importantly, is not finished. There are still sealed boxes in private collections, still uncatalogued ledgers in regional archives, still attics where, behind trunks of clothes and stacks of magazines, a brittle envelope may yet bear her initials. Somewhere, in a house that once belonged to a Whitney descendant, there is a narrow closet that does not match the architect's plans. Somewhere, in a museum storage room, an unlabeled portrait waits with a name penciled faintly on the back. The legacy of Amalia Whitney, lost on purpose, has become a kind of quiet pressure in the historical record, pushing outward from every faint notation and half-scraped inscription. And if you walk today through one of the former Whitney mansions that has been turned into offices or galleries, you might eventually find yourself in a corridor where the floorboards creak in a different rhythm, where one stretch of wall seems just slightly thicker than the others. On that wall, a framed fragment of an original estate inventory hangs for decoration, a list of paintings and objects no longer present. Beside Portrait of Miss A, oil, seated, terrace background, someone has drawn a tidy line through the entry and written in an old firm hand, "Removed." No date, no destination, just that word. Under the glass, the struck-through title of the missing canvas sits like a closed door in the middle of the page, and for a long, heavy moment, it feels less like a simple notation and more like a promise that whatever lies behind that erasure has not told you everything yet. When we step back from the ledgers, the erased wills, and the scratched-out portraits, we are left with something deceptively simple: a single line in an inventory, a title, struck through and replaced with one word: removed. Around that quiet act of deletion, an entire Gilded Age machinery of power turns in the half-light. Doors were closed, documents were walked down to hidden safes, corridors were kept dim so that certain names would never be spoken to clearly. The case of Amalia Whitney does not resolve into a confession. It settles instead into a pattern of choices, each one small, each one deliberate, that together rewrote the history of a family and buried a rightful heir in dust and silence. Tonight, we have only brushed the dust aside. The forbidden rooms of the Whitney world still hold corners the light has not fully reached. Every erased record, every altered clause, every missing canvas reminds us that what we call legacy can be, in truth, a carefully tended illusion. If stories like this one speak to you, let us know. It tells the algorithm that guards these digital corridors that these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. Every careful reading of the evidence brings a name like Amalia's back one fraction of an inch from the edge. Because this is not the only house built on hidden heirs. Across the Gilded Age, other mansions, other dynasties, other sealed vaults still wait behind their own locked panels and false walls. This channel exists to follow those faint pencil marks in the margins, to push on the places where the floor sounds hollow so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. Others, like Amalia Whitney's, linger in the echo between what was written and what was erased, quiet, patient, and still powerful enough to change the way we see every corridor we walk through after we leave this one.